Alright everyone, we're finally coming to the end of the longest flashback in One Piece history, and I think that almost all character storylines are closing up really well here. Because Harold has been a very controversial character over the course of this whole flashback. I have a feeling that no matter what happens in the next chapter or two, many readers are simply not going to forgive Harold for his behavior throughout this storyline, and particularly how he abandoned Rocks. But I think we are being a bit too harsh here because what Oda is really communicating is a lot more layered. We're gonna get into Harold in a second, but first I do want to appreciate Ida's death scene. I really enjoyed this scene because even though Ida hasn't been a prominent enough character throughout the flashback to really warrant a grand, memorable, iconic sort of scene like a Hero Look or a Bellemere, I think Oda played his cards with this relatively minor side character perfectly well. I think every single bit of screen time that Ida got over the course of this very saturated flashback in terms of just sheer number of character storylines, Oda was able to make her shine through as this sort of voice of peace and love and reason in every instance. So I think Oda wrote this character perfectly well for the role that she needed to play, and she's a very subtly significant character throughout all of what's happening over the course of this Rocks and Harold storyline. And so again, the death that he gives her, it's not big, it's not loud or anything like that, but what he does with it is pretty creative. It's not something that we've seen Oda do before. He has Harold and Ida have this sort of final conversation filled with hope and reminiscing and excitedly talking about their future together and how things are going to be just like when they were younger. And then Oda reveals at the end of their conversation that they're both going through all this knowing in the back of their minds that it's never going to happen and that this really is the end for Ida. And so it's this sort of beautifully bittersweet final conversation between the two. It's not Oda's usual style of big dramatic deaths, but it hits hard in a different way and it makes you appreciate the dynamic between the two characters, and this low-key is actually maybe one of my favorite little love storylines in One Piece at the end of the day. Now, in terms of Harold himself, I do hope that this chapter did allow readers to at least somewhat appreciate what he has done, because while he did arguably go too far in the direction that he chose of just absolute commitment to peace, making good with the humans at whatever cost, without even questioning, am I working with the right people to do this? And you even have Saul and Ida kind of gently prodding and being like, are you sure about this and everything that you've done? At the same time, what we are shown is that while Harold was misguided in some ways, obviously working with the world government, the reality is that that extreme commitment to peace and mending ways with the humans and showing a different face to the world and changing that violent warrior culture at its core is paying dividends. The rest of the world is coming to appreciate the giants. And I think it would have really helped if Oda had maybe gone out of his way more beforehand to show us, like to truly show us just how violent and terrible the giants were to humans for centuries. Because what Oda prefers to do is just tell us repeatedly, to be fair, he does repeatedly tell us that the giants were really terrible and did traumatize and torment and really probably kill a lot of humans in the past. Oda also doesn't really want to visibly show that to us because at the end of the day, it is One Piece and Oda is trying to redeem the giants, so maybe he doesn't want to show us a long history of the giants basically killing or genociding various islands of humans, etc. He just wants to tell us that that's a thing and then establish that, look, a lot of work needs to be done to repair those sort of relationships, and that Harold has to do a lot of essentially making good to fix things for the giants and make for a more harmonious world down the line. Because one thing that is very clear is that the ideals that Harold is chasing here, which is a world where giants and all other races can live together in harmony, that is correct, and that is something that could only have taken a big step forward thanks to Harold being as committed as he was in that direction. In fact, the words that Harold is saying here are very reminiscent of Otohime, and everybody loves Otohime. People don't get on Otohime's case for choosing to work alongside the Celestial Dragons, but I think that people give Otohime a pass because she's the most weak character in One Piece history. She's arguably the weakest character to ever exist, in that her bones were so fragile that they would break like they were made of paper. But the whole point is that Harold going down this path actually has more meaning, because Harold from birth is possibly the strongest character that we've ever had, genetically speaking, in One Piece. Not just an ancient giant, but a freakishly strong ancient giant, even by giant standards. So I think we look at Harold a little bit differently for basically being the strongest being on the ocean at this point, now that Rocks is dead. A character who could fight against the world government, who is almost born to fight, but is instead going down this extreme Otohime-esque path of just absolute commitment to peace, harmony, working alongside the world government and the Celestial Dragons to make that happen. Now, I'm not saying Harold and Otahime don't have some differences, and Harold has done a lot of morally questionable things like abandoning Rox and even becoming a tool for the world government, but I'm just pointing out the interesting parallels between the characters and the idea that Oda is pushing, which is that ultimately Oda is never going to portray this sort of extreme commitment to peace as being wrong. That principle, at the very least, even if it doesn't always get the desired result, is always going to be an admirable character trait. And it is presented as such with both Otahime and with Harold. And Oda is saying something there in that it doesn't matter if you're the weakest character in existence like Otahime or the strongest character in existence like Harold. That adherence to that sort of principle is valuable either way. And even though Harold up in many ways, the one thing you cannot deny is that he made Elbaf a better place, and he fixed human and giant relationships, which is essentially a practically impossible Herculean task considering it's literally centuries of giants as a race on the whole abusing their strength and using violence against humans. That is a huge victory for Harold, even if he dies at the end of the flashback, just as Otahime made great strides towards fixing Fishman's attitudes towards humans, even if she dies at the end of her flashback. I would say the biggest area where Harold miscalculated was that he didn't understand the nature of humans. Harold's impression was that he was negotiating and essentially performing diplomacy with the governing body of the humans, the world government. The world government is essentially the gatekeeper to the Giants of Elbaf being able to fully integrate and become part of what Harold views as a harmonious society alongside all other humans. What Harold fundamentally didn't understand is that the humans who make up the governing body of mankind, they also oppress other humans. So while Harold thinks he's negotiating with mankind, he's actually negotiating with the people who oppress mankind, and that is where the disconnect lies. And maybe he should have listened to Rox, but I also think that Rox should have probably explained a bit more to him at some point, like, hey, there's this guy Emu out there who rules the world, and it's really terrible, and he's sunk pretty much the vast majority of the planet, and that's why we all have to live on islands now, and a lot of this is connected to the Harley text and all of that stuff you have on your mural and stuff. But maybe Rox and Harold didn't have that kind of talk. I think Oda fundamentally had to have them just never address or explain certain things to each other, otherwise the story can't work. Again, I'm not excusing everything that Harold has done, but sitting back and looking at it holistically, he is an admirable character in his own right, just his greatest flaw is naivety and ignorance, and I think readers tend to be less forgiving of characters that just don't seem to get it the way that we are able to get it from an outside reader's perspective. But before we get into it, it's time to lose your shit, because we are doing a huge holiday sale where you can buy 2 posters and get 4 free. That's right. Buy 2, get any 4 free. And we mean any 4 because for this December only, we are bringing back all our poster collections. All the island posters, all the ships posters, and of course all our boss posters. And we even have new posters for these collections. Maxim, the Sea Train, Ace's Ship Striker, Garling, Shamrock, and for December only, we have the Skypiea version of Going Merry and Dami Reversi Rox. Just mix and match any posters you like from across all collections, and the huge discount will be automatically applied at checkout. After this December, the whole deal goes away, along with the Going Merry and Rox. Lastly, you also have a chance to win any complete collection of your choosing for free, just by following us on our One Dream Studio Instagram page. We'll be picking a winner from all of our followers on December 9th, so go follow now because it's coming up fast. And anyone who makes a purchase gets a double entry into the giveaway, so get your holiday poster deals now while you can. Now, as the events of this chapter progress, what's interesting is that there are 2 events that support both of the recent theories that I've made in the last week. First, Shanks just up and leaving the Holy Knights. That suggests that he got something that he needed out of the experience and then left. I theorized last week that Shanks' true goal in joining the Holy Knights was to get more information about the whereabouts of the Nika fruit. As the world government historically have been the ones who have been trying to track its whereabouts, joining them might have given Shanks some clues. And obviously, right after Shanks quitting the Celestial Dragons, the very next time that we see him is conveniently at Elbaf, where the Nika fruit is. I do believe that strongly supports the notion that Shanks essentially figured something out during his tenure as play acting as one of the God's Blades. He realized that what he was looking for is at Elbaf. That's what ends him up at Elbaf, but it just so happens to also be at the same moment that Imu is enacting his plan to force Harald, the king of Elbaf, to turn all of his giant warriors into Imu's soldiers. So everything kind of just naturally ends up coinciding out of fate. And then recently I also did a video talking about how Imu's powers work, and one of the big aspects of that was that Imu's own immortality can be granted at varying levels depending on the level of sea contract that you have. And as I said, with the Deep Sea contract, Harald now gains a portion of Imu's immortality, which is regeneration that all the Holy Knights, the other users of the Deep Sea contract, tend to have. And once you get the final level of the contract, the Deep Sea contract, like the Gorosei presumably have, that's when you also get the next level of immortality, which is Prevention of Aging, aka Eternal Youth. So they're essentially steps to immortality to get to the final level of Eternal Youth. First comes regeneration, then comes Prevention of Aging. And these are both products of the Ope Ope no Mi surgery that was done on Imu himself. Imu simply has the Sea Devil powers, which means that any powers that he himself possesses, he's able to pass on to his subordinates, and just like that, all of the contracts and the varying abilities of the God's Knights and the Gorosei make sense. And finally, with the ending of the chapter, Harald being controlled by Imu made for a really cool visual. It seems like once you have one of the 2 higher level contracts that Imu can now Dami reverse you whenever he wants. And this sets up obviously for the confrontation between Loki, Jarl, and Harald, as well as all of the guards. The fact that Harald is still somewhat fighting back against the Dami Reversi may explain how Loki was able to kill Harald. It's possible that Harald is able to resist the Dami Reversi long enough for Loki to kill him, much like we saw that Rox was able to resist the full subjugation effects of the Dami Reversi for some period of time and have this full back and forth argument with Imu before he finally succumbed himself. So next chapter we should get some cool action, and really the finale of the flashback. I expect maybe one more chapter after that, just recapping a lot of Loki's journey before cutting back to the modern day. So maybe we're ending this flashback at around chapter 1170 or 1171, something like that. And finally, we have a Voice of the People, my top tier of patrons. So Justin Holland said that when all is said and done, while Harald did set the foundation for Elbaf to go on the right track to a better tomorrow, his efforts to do so are tainted by his hatred for his bloody past self, which ends up blinding him to the full scope of the dangers of submitting himself to the world's Sea Devil. Perhaps this chapter also feeds into another theme that has only come to the surface recently, the concept of balance in things, including ideals. So yes, with Harald, he goes too far in pursuit of his ideal, basically throwing logic and reasoning and just general healthy skepticism out the window. I think in One Piece though, the idea that ideals can get you killed has always been a thing. Like Bellemere couldn't even stand saying that I don't have a family for 2 minutes, even at the cost of her own life. Her not being able to say those words got her killed. Her commitment to just having a family and not wanting to reject that. Look, this quack doctor who's just so focused on having a good heart and believing that as long as my heart's in the right place, I will be able to cure people somehow, while having no expertise as a doctor. This is the type of thing we've seen over and over in One Piece, which is that these characters, particularly in flashbacks, who have such powerful commitment to ideals, but they're unreasonable. And Oda's never going to portray that extreme commitment to ideals in a negative light. I mean, just look at Sanji, right? Like, Sanji will never kick a woman no matter what, even if it gets him defeated in the Enies Lobby raid, and potentially even puts the rest of his crew in danger. Oda's not necessarily critiquing those scenarios. He's showing the flaws in terms of pursuing ideals just relentlessly and without any sense of compromise, but he's still putting that sort of conviction on a pedestal, and that's why it's not black and white. The idea is that there's both good and bad that can come with this sort of extreme commitment. But I think the overarching idea of One Piece is that if only most people in the world were driven by these sort of pure ideals, then maybe the world would be a better place. So people who are extremely committed to these ideals that gets them killed or leads to bad consequences, that goes to show the difficulty in sort of following the right path. And it basically communicates that following the right path won't always get you to your desired outcome, but it can lead to making the world a better place overall. And that is an idea that I expand on in great detail in this upcoming Tuesday video, which I think is a very interesting analysis of this entire Rox and Harald flashback that I encourage you all to watch. So with that, I give this chapter a solid 8 out of 10, and I will talk to you all next week.